Christopher Columbus was not the first person to discover the Americas. He wasn't even the first European. However, he was the first person to report back his findings to Europe. And that's the part right there that ended up mattering the most, and it completely changed the history of the world. Following his infamous voyage, the fates of two continents were changed forever. So here's what I want to figure out. How did Columbus manage to secure vast amounts of money for this voyage? How did he fund something that would change the entire history of the world? Now, contrary to popular belief, Columbus did not kickstart the age of exploration. By his time, several European nations were spending vast amounts of money behind explorers, hoping that they would find new lands and new fortune. In particular, they wanted to find new routes to the rich Asian empires of India and China. With the fall of the Mongol Empire, land routes became more dangerous and more difficult to navigate. The Europeans wanted to find sea routes instead. And amongst the nations that wanted to tap into the limitless riches of the Far East was Spain. Now look, these rulers were ambitious. They had just finished the Reconquista, a centuries-long war against Muslims and Jews for the control over Iberia. Now that that was complete, they wanted to turn their attention to other parts of the world. But its neighbor, Portugal, already had a head start in the exploration game. In fact, they had already found a route to India by sailing through the West African coast and around the Cape of Good Hope. That's why Spain was desperate to find an alternate route and get ahead of its rival. But then came this dude, Columbus. He came up with this brilliant idea, sailing west. He thought, why not sail west across the Atlantic instead of going around the entire continent of Africa? Now look, this does sound logical, and it's great on paper. But in practice, there were some really glaring issues, and in this case, his biggest mistake was that the math didn't add up. For some reason, Columbus thought that the Earth was much smaller than it actually was. He started pitching this idea, but of course, understandably, governments actually listened to their own experts, and they rejected Columbus's idea. These experts determined that the distance between Europe and China was just too great to achieve by sailing westwards. Columbus was rejected by the Portuguese, the English, and the French. But he was persistent. He pitched this idea to anyone who would listen for almost a decade. Finally, he approached the Spanish crown with his idea, and even though he was rejected the first two times, the third attempt, he struck gold. But here's the thing, he was not approved because of the business and profit merits in mind. Apart from trade, another factor here influenced the Spanish king's decision, and that was religious fanaticism. Emboldened by their victory over the Muslims in Iberia, the Spanish now looked to extend their ultimate triumph over the Islamic world. They assumed that a direct attack east would be impractical. The Ottoman Empire had just grown too powerful by then, so the Spanish believed they could attack where it was least expected, from the other end of the world's corner. That's a big part of the reason why they said yes to Columbus. Not only did they agree to fund Columbus's voyage, but they also gave him a host of generous promises. He could keep 10% of whatever riches he could find, he was given a noble title, and governorship of any lands that he would encounter. It was a pretty good deal. Now, the cost of the voyage itself was honestly surprisingly low. It was only 2 million Spanish maravedis. And this amounted to about $1 million in today's currency. Columbus also used 3 ships for his expedition. They were the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria. Santa Maria was the biggest of all 3 ships, capable of carrying 110 tons of cargo. While there are no records of its cost, we can make somewhat of an educated guess. Santa Maria was a carrack, which is basically a sailing ship appropriate for that time. However, it was much smaller than the ones that were built later on, so a carrack is capable of carrying 1,000 tons of cargo, which costed about 50,000 cruzados. Cruzados were gold coins weighing about 0.11 troy ounces, and that equals about 5,500 troy ounces of gold. Since the Santa Maria was 10 times smaller in volume, we can say that the cost was about 550 troy ounces of gold, which would be worth about $1.3 million. And the other 2 ships were about half of its size, so the whole expedition, including the ships, would probably roughly cost around $3 million. Again, these are all my very rough calculations, so take it with a pinch of salt. So, for this untested, poorly calculated voyage, Columbus was now all set to go. with the funding and blessings from the Spanish monarchy. But the problem was, Columbus wasn't really an explorer. He was skilled at ocean navigation, sure, but he actually never set sail into an unknown territory in his life. Before this, his biggest exploit was going to Iceland and Ireland on basically a business trip. But now, here he was commanding 3 ships and 90 souls on a mission to the world's end. I mean, that's why it's not surprising that in so many instances, the trip nearly ended in disaster. The voyage went off to a good start, with them sailing southwards to the Canary Islands instead of due west to the Azores. This allowed his ships to pick up trade winds, making the journey much faster. So there's some credit to Columbus's navigation skills here, but his math was all wrong. Days passed into weeks and there was no sign of land anywhere. Eventually, his crew started becoming very impatient and they grew mutinous and they wanted to turn back. Now, sometimes I picture Columbus as a shady startup founder who keeps running out of funding but tries to persuade his employees to stay on in the hopes of making it big. He tried to do the same thing with his own crew. He managed to talk down his crew and address their fears, at least temporarily, convincing them that success was just around the corner. Luckily for Columbus, he sighted land eventually. Well, not him exactly, it was one of his ships. He did take credit for himself later on. But yeah, they did spot land. But simply spotting land was not enough. To please his royal investors, he had to come back with something of actual substance. After planting the royal banner, he set sail for Cuba, wrongly believing it to be the fabled Cipango or Japan. Now there, at least, he found some gold and prosperity to save face when he returned. His return voyage ended up being quite difficult. Santa Maria, which was his biggest ship, actually struck a reef and sank. So now he had his crew with only 2 smaller ships. Nearly half a year after leaving Spain, they made their return journey. Things took a turn for the worse when they got caught up in a horrible storm, and around that time they had to seek refuge in the Azores, which was held by Portugal. Now you'll remember that Portugal and Spain had a pretty fierce rivalry, and they ended up being arrested. But somehow, Columbus would manage not only to secure their release, but get an audience with the Portuguese king, John II. Anyway, after their final return to Spain, he would be given a hero's welcome. In his letter, he told of his great discoveries and how he reached the impossible, Asia. Now, with promises of untold riches, he would have no problem of securing an even bigger investment for his second voyage. This time around, it would be a war fleet meant not only to explore, but to conquer and colonize. Fiction is stranger than reality. I mean, many skilled explorers at that time failed and perished trying to discover new lands. And here you have a religious fanatic who was bad at math, bad at geography, who was being celebrated for landing on an entirely new continent by mistake.